glitch. But all right, one more second. All right, that is set, and one more time. All right, great. Good evening, and welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to be introducing our presentation, Pablo Picasso's Blue Period and the Legacy of Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, with Kenneth Brummel, Susan Behrens Frank, and Aimée Brown-Price. Before we begin, I would like to thank our panelists for being here, and I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to join us in the audience. It's a perfect day for a virtual lecture in New York City, that's for sure, but wherever you're tuning in from, we're just grateful that you can be here. I would also like to recognize that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is generously supported by an award from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many individual contributors. Please do consider making a donation to the New York Studio School by visiting our website and the donations page. I will try and speak a little bit louder. And I also want to call attention, before I introduce our panelists, I want to call attention to the Q&A button and the chat button at the bottom of your screens. Please do enter in a question at any time, and we'll leave time at the end for Q&A for more questions. But if something comes up, please put it in. And I also just want to quickly point out that we're well in the middle of our lecture season at the Studio School. So if you're joining us for the first time, please have a look at the upcoming lectures in the remainder of our season. And with that, Aimée, do you want to hold off for 1 second?
Sorry.
No worries, it works. So tonight, Kenneth Brummel is currently Associate Curator of Modern Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Starting on May 2nd, he will be Curator of 20th Century Art at the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. Congratulations, Kenneth.
Thank you.
Selected exhibitions at the Art Gallery of Ontario include Picasso, Painting the Blue Period, Andy Warhol, Mitchell Riopelle, Nothing in Moderation, Anthony Caro, Sculpture Laid Bare, and Painting Tranquility, Masterworks by Vilhelm Hammershøi. Prior to joining the AGO in 2014, Kenneth held curatorial positions in several major art museums in the United States, including Cincinnati Art Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City. He holds a master's in art history from the University of Chicago. Our second panelist is Susan Behrens Frank. She's curator at the Phillips Collection and earned her PhD with an award-winning dissertation on Spanish and French surrealism, focused on Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel. At the Phillips, she has curated and overseen more than 20 exhibitions on European and American art and lectured internationally on the museum's founder, Duncan Phillips. And our final panelist is Aimée Brown-Price, who's an art historian with a PhD from Yale University. And she's the author of 2 volumes of Pierre Puvis de Chavannes and has contributed numerous essays to the Art Bulletin, Art in America, the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, and numerous catalogs as well. She was a guest curator at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, the Bunkumura and Shamani Museums of Japan, and she has taught and lectured extensively in the United States, including here at the New York Studio School, as well as abroad. She was also awarded a Chevalier in Arts and Letters. And finally, the exhibition is the Picasso Painting the Blue Period exhibition is currently at the Phillips, which opened on February 26th and closes June 12th. And we're very excited to hear what our panelists have to say about this. So please join me in a virtual welcome for Picasso Blue Period.
All right, so I'm going to start this off, and I'm just going to introduce here the exhibition thesis for our project that Kenneth and I co-curated, Picasso Painting the Blue Period. It's the foundational part of this exhibition is really the 3 Blue Period paintings that are in our respective museum collections. On the left is the Blue Room by Picasso, Paris, 1901. And in the center is the Art Gallery of Ontario's Crouching Beggar Woman from Barcelona in 1902. And on the far right is the Art Gallery of Ontario's 1903 painting, The Soup. And so these 3 paintings form the foundation of our project, and they are really pivotal to discussing Picasso's artistic development from 1901 through 1903, as each marks a moment, beginning in a significant career stage for Picasso. So Kenneth, can we go to the next slide? I don't know if I'm getting feedback on the sound, but the slide you see here is really about the exhibition's genesis, which began with advanced technical studies on the Phillips painting, The Blue Room. On the left, you see a photograph taken in the Phillips Conservation Studio in July of 2018 with National Gallery of Art senior imaging specialist John Delaney on the left, and the Phillips Associate Conservator, Patty Favero, on the right. Patty is the individual who has overseen the Phillips studies of the Blue Room from the outset, beginning in 2007, shortly after we expanded our conservation space at the Phillips, and we acquired new technical equipment, specifically an infrared, digital infrared camera. Patty went forward with an opportunity to look closely using this camera to see if she could digitally bring forward what we knew was an image underneath the Blue Room because of a 1997 X-radiograph. And further studies were undertaken after she revealed really remarkably clear image. What you see on the screen next to the Blue Room is a more recent infrared reflectance image that was created by Dr. John Delaney. But Patty's original studies really led us to go and delve deeper into what we could understand about the Blue Room, the hidden painting, and Picasso's materials and his practice. And this is in 2012. And so there were only a handful of museums in the United States that were able to do this kind of very cutting edge study of paintings that, did not degrade or take anything away, but just looked beneath the surface image. And when I say there are very few, the National Gallery of Art is one of those. And because they are our neighbors in Washington, we're able to cooperate and work with them. The Guggenheim Museum in New York was doing studies around this time as well on their woman ironing in the Tannhauser collection. And the Art Institute of Chicago was doing studies as well on Blue Period works in their collection. And then Anne Honigswald, who was head of paintings conversation at the National Gallery, was leading studies at the National Gallery. So the Phillips really kind of joined with these US museums in this cutting edge moment. And it was really at that time that I kind of jumped in as curator and thought we should do something significant as an exhibition. And so we learned a great deal about both the painting underneath the Blue Room and the Blue Room itself. And on the right of the screen, I just show you a false color infrared reflectance image that reveals that Picasso simply took this portrait that you see on the screen, turned it 90 degrees counterclockwise. We learned there is no ground between the portrait and the image on the surface. Picasso simply painted very thinly with Prussian blue directly on top of that portrait to create this very complex composition of the bather in the tub in this interior environment. And so these studies really are the formation of the foundation of the exhibition, and originated an idea. Kenneth, I think you need to go to the next slide perhaps. That would be a dossier show, if you will, in which the Blue Room from the Phillips collection would be a foundational part of the project. So the Phillips in the summer of 2014 released the information about this hidden portrait to the press through the Associated Press. Got an enormous response back, and the small painting that you see to the right of the Blue Room on the screen is a work in a private collection that we learned about after that press in the summer of 2014. And the owner of that work was enthusiastic about lending it to an exhibition. So I needed to find a partner to do a project on Picasso, a very complicated artist to work with in this early moment of his career, the Blue Period. And so I had conversations with two curators at the Art Gallery of Ontario, one in 2012 with a former chief curator there who visited the Phillips, and I spoke to him about the Blue Room. And what I was looking at the time were similar motifs of the figure that could be related to the Blue Room. And also, as you see on the bottom of the screen, you see these 6 images from the Art Gallery of Ontario's permanent collection. The image on the left, a woman with a necklace from the summer of 1901, was an extremely pivotal picture to our research on this hidden portrait, because it really helped us clarify a date for this hidden portrait, and it revealed a lot of similarities in a style, pose, that were, we believed, essential to try to convey in an exhibition. So I had a follow-up conversation in 2014 with a now retired curator of prints and drawings, who was at the Phillips in the summer of 2014 because she was looking for some work from the Phillips for her project. And she encouraged me to go up to Toronto and meet with the director and other staff that she was going to introduce me to, which included Kenneth. And I presented, the project and showed, these works that were important to the project as I had been able to work it out to that extent. And I also made mention to them, and Kenneth can speak about this more, about how Patty Favero, Julie Barton from the Guggenheim, and Alison Langley from the Art Institute, and Anna Hodingswald from the National Gallery were all participating in a symposium at the Musée Picasso in Barcelona in January of 2015 that was going to be discussing a lot of the information about hidden imagery in early Picasso works. And the Art Gallery of Ontario, Kenneth and his colleague Sandra Webster Cook in conservation were enthusiastic from the outset. And so I give it to Kenneth now to talk about what happened after that.
Thank you, Sue. And yes, Sue is correct. In 2014, when I was in my second week as an assistant curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario, she arrived with a checklist for a dossier exhibition on the Blue Room, which included our 2 Blue Period paintings at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I was enthusiastic to participate in this project precisely because during my interviews for the position, I explained that the Art Gallery of Ontario had strengths in early Picasso, and it would behoove the institution to have an exhibition on early Picasso. Sue arrives with her dossier exhibition, and after Sue invited us to Barcelona, and Sandra Webster Cook and I, and Sandra is standing next to me in this photograph, we were able, through Sue and Patty, who invited us to a professional lunch in Barcelona, we were able to meet John Delaney, who you see pictured above, who visited us in 2016 in order to scan our 2 blue period paintings, La Mise Russe Accroupie, the Crouching Beggar Woman, and La Soupe, or the Soup, with his infrared reflectance spectroscopic device. And we also met Francesca Casadillo at that lunch, and she is now the director of conservation at the Art Institute of Chicago. And she was able to bring a portable MAXRF scanner to Toronto so we can analyze the underlying pigments, in addition to studying the underlying compositions that John Delaney was able to visualize. Here you have a sampling of the kinds of visualizations these scientists are able to provide. Using that information, Sue and I transformed the dossier exhibition she arrived with from Philip's collection into what we can call an expanded dossier exhibition, or a dossier exhibition that was tripled, because we created an exhibition on the early Picasso, the blue period, 1901 to 1903, with works of art that related both to the surface compositions and the underlying motifs of our pictures, so that we can give the viewer a comprehensive overview of Picasso's intellectual and artistic development during these formative years. In the exhibition, we staged conversations between blue period paintings, such as the Blue Room here, with works that we know Picasso saw and studied. So what you see here is the Blue Room. Here we have a cast of Eve. We know Picasso in 1900 saw the plaster at the Place d'Alma Pavilion of Rodin, and we are able to juxtapose these works we know Picasso saw and studied with the actual painting, so the viewer can see how Picasso adapted and transformed the motifs of his precursors. Here you see a Degas lithograph. Here you see Rodin's Crouching Woman, which relates to the figure in the Art Institute of Chicago's 1901 painting. Here's another installation shot of the exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And you see the Rodin in the foreground, juxtaposed with Picasso's first sculpture from 1902, Crouching Woman. But importantly, you see these bust portraits on the back wall, one from Nagoya, the Aichi Prefectural Museum, Woman in Blue Shawl. You see Baltimore's Woman with Bangs, these bust portraits of downtrodden women in Barcelona. And what Sue and I wanted to do in order to show how Picasso transformed the downtrodden women of Barcelona in 1902 into secularized Madonnas was to juxtapose it with a Luis de Morales, a Virgen Dolorosa, a Virgin of Sorrows, that Picasso saw and studied in Prado. And it was key for Sue and I to execute a successful exhibition by staging these conversations between Picasso's works and works we know he saw and studied. And we were very rigorous and scrupulous about ensuring that anything included in this exhibition was documented.
So in terms of the work that is included in this show and where we started the exhibition, we began it really with the Velar Exhibition that was June 25th, 1901, primarily because this painting underneath the Blue Room is a work that speaks to that moment when Picasso has returned to Paris for the second time in order to go and produce a body of work for this first opportunity to exhibit in Paris. And I think it's important for us to recall that Picasso was 19 years old at this time. He had made a first trip to Paris in the fall of 1900 because one of his paintings called Last Moments was on exhibit in the Spanish Pavilion for the Universal Exhibition. And he had an opportunity at that time to see firsthand the work of Toulouse-Lautrec. He had known it through magazines, journals, but he had not actually had the opportunity to see it. And so it was impressive to him. And in 1901, when he returned to Paris in May, he had about 6 weeks to produce over 60 works for this exhibition at the Galerie Velar. And he used many different styles. He was borrowing style and subject matter from a variety of artists, be it Degas and Forain, as Steinlen, as well as Toulouse-Lautrec. But one of the things that we wanted to emphasize in the exhibition is context for this portrait, Under the Blue Room. And we were really thrilled and successful in getting this loan from the Israel Museum, where the Art Gallery of Ontario has put this woman with a necklace on permanent loan. But I think one of the things that you can see from the infrared of our hidden portrait is that Picasso is using outlining that he was identifying as a style that he could transform in his own work from Toulouse-Lautrec's work. The painting, The Diners, is one that the palette for this hidden portrait is very similar to the reds and yellows and the greens that we see in that painting from the Museum of Art at the Rhode Island School of Design. In fact, what we know about our hidden portrait is that what seems to be a yellow pillow or a banquette that the gentleman is seated on is yellow. His shirt is lead white. His jacket, which is outlined in Prussian blue mixed with bone black, is basically a Prussian blue. But on that white shirt is what appears to be a flower, but definitely it is red and yellow. And I think you might be able to see that, holding that flower is his left hand coming out of his jacket sleeve. But one thing that you can see is that there is a simplification of form that is going on in these works, the woman with necklace and the hidden portrait, that date from the weeks after Velar's show opened. But in the self-portrait and top half that you see here as well, one of the things that I take away that we want for the visitor is to see how Picasso took from Toulouse-Lautrec, but also made it his own. So that this lithograph that you see on the right by Toulouse-Lautrec, the Queen of Joy, a lithograph that may have had as large a run as like 3,000 prints. So Picasso would more than likely have had opportunity to see it. Picasso shows you a bit different approach to the same subject matter that Toulouse-Lautrec was interested in. Picasso recognized the graphic expertise and the gifts of Toulouse-Lautrec's work and how his life and his art really merged together. They shared this enthusiasm for nightlife in Montmartre and this kind of seedy world of the brothel and of the men who came to patronize this part of Paris. And you see that Picasso shows you this gentleman who balding hairline is similar to our gentleman in the hidden portrait in the Risdi painting. Seems to be bored with his young woman that attends him. But also one of the things that is very noticeable in this painting is that kind of decapitation, severe decapitation of the top half of the woman who is standing behind. And that is something that Picasso could have taken from from posters by Toulouse-Lautrec, but he's definitely made it a more kind of deeply not just taking off the decapitating her head figure as he did in a Jean Avril poster, but made it like the whole half of her body. And also in the self-portrait and top hat, he's showing us he's not leering at these young women, he's looking out at us. So Picasso is making his own statement in these things, in these works. And so Kenneth, the next slide. And so we're trying to contextualize the blue period icon of the Blue Room in this exhibition, as well as the painting underneath. And so the Blue Room is, through our studies, I have made the argument that it's both a summary and an origin painting. It's a very complex composition. It is like a stage set, a mise en scène, very different than the individual portraits of nudes that Picasso was doing in advance of this. What we know, because there is no mixing of the colors, the paint, between the portrait and the painting of the Blue Room, so that the portrait was dry when Picasso painted over it. And so this gives us a time frame for looking at the Blue Room that we did not really have previously. Scholars have been all over the place about when to date this painting, from late summer into the fall, but we have been able to confidently place it in late October, early November, because the hidden portrait stylistically fits into a period in early July 1901, which is similar to that time frame for the woman with a necklace. And 4 months is a kind of standard time for the oil to dry. So the significance of this really becomes apparent when you realize that Picasso turned 20 on October 25th of that year. Kind of a significant birthday for a young artist. And he includes, and I just want to mention that Toulouse-Lautrec died on September 9th of 1901 at the age of 36. And so that was a significant watershed moment for Picasso as well. In the fall, he was more reflective about his work and his life than he had been when he arrived in Paris in May of that same year, enthusiastic about producing and having this first Paris exhibition. And so we see him looking at the artists who are of great interest to him in Paris, that include Toulouse-Lautrec, represented in the Blue Room by the poster of May Milton in the background. Next to that poster is a seascape from Barcelona that is very much a reference to Picasso's own work called The Mediterranean, that he had painted in Barcelona on the way to Paris that spring and had exhibited at the Velar show, but it did not sell. So it had come back to him in the studio. But he places it very carefully on the wall, very close to the Toulouse-Lautrec painting, picture, poster. And then we know that it is primarily Prussian blue that is used throughout the composition, except for the water in this seascape, which is ultramarine. So Picasso deliberately altered the blue that was used for his own work in this composition. The view out the window matches the view in this Blue Roofs Paris painting that he did. And also you see this photograph of his studio that was taken likely in May or June at the time of his, when he first arrived and had this photograph. I don't know if you can see my mouse on this screen or whether Kenneth needs to use his mouse. So, and this table that you see on the right in the painting is also matches this table and the buckets of dried flowers that we see in the photograph. So Picasso is acknowledged as having used his own living space, his own studio workspace in Paris as the model for this stage set of the bather in the tub. And he is looking to Degas, whom he has looked at in Paris. This lithograph we have in the exhibition is one we think Picasso may have had opportunity to see. And certainly he would have seen the pastel monotypes that are at the Musée de Luxembourg from the Caillebotte bequest. He was certainly have been aware of Toulouse-Lautrec's portfolio of L, in which you see here this beautiful cover image of the prostitute in the Maison's clothes, putting water in the zinc tub with her pitcher. And then Rodin, such an important figure for Picasso during the period of 1901 and in the blue period that followed after he returned to Barcelona. Figure that Kenneth pointed out of Eve that Picasso would have seen in the Pavilion de l'Alma by Rodin in 1900. These enclosed figures, the idea of pose and gesture speaking to melancholic interior feelings and emotions. And so the Blue Room becomes an allegory of modern art in which Picasso inserts a self-referent. It is a painting that speaks also to the future. It summarizes Picasso's most favored French artists at the time. He puts himself in conversation with them. And he also looks to the future where the studio, the artist studio, the model in the studio become the recurrent motif. But it is notable that this is the last appearance of the nude for about 4 years. And the nude does not reappear in Picasso's work until early 1905. And so, and the toilette per se does not, at the bather does not reoccur for quite some time, but the idea of the woman grooming her hair does occur. So Kenneth, you go on to the next slide. Now that I've talked too long, but the Paris Blue period begins in the fall of 1901. And so the Blue Room is definitely a part of this moment, the shift that occurs in Picasso's work, beginning in the late summer and in the autumn after Picasso has begun to visit the hospital and women's prison known as Saint-Lazare. And he is also very reflective at this moment on the suicide of his Barcelona friend, Carlos Casagemas. And so these are the paintings that are from the Blue period in Paris, this is when the Blue period emerges. Picasso becomes more interested in blue as a dominant color. And throughout the fall, there is more and more of an investment in exploring a monochrome palette. And these 7 paintings that you see on the screen are all in our exhibition. And I think one of the things that's quite revealing is how different they are stylistically from each other. There is no single style. The Blue period itself is not something that a title that Picasso gave these works. That was a title that was assigned to this period by the critic Gustave Coquillot in 1914. Although Apollinaire did write about the wet and blue moment of the Blue period in 1905 in a critical review of the Saltimbanque imagery. But one of the things that's most notable is like this painting on the far left, the woman and child by fountain. You know, perhaps early in the emergence of the Blue period, when Picasso is like so aware of this burden that women carry from his experience at Saint-Lazare. You know, we're talking a 19-year-old young man who had, carefree view of casual sexual interaction with women after he was in Paris in the fall of 1900 and again in 1901. And this bright palette that was so much a part of his Velar early 1901 work no longer seemed appropriate after the kind of sobering experience of seeing these impoverished women who were incarcerated in this prison. You know, there was one group of them that were there for petty crimes, including being unregistered as, prostitution. And there was another section that were administrative, who were prostitutes who were violation of regulations or suffering from venereal disease. So this was Picasso's really first experience of seeing that sexual activity could lead to disease and death. And it was the women, impoverished women, who carried the burden of the consequences of sexual activity. And one of the really disturbing parts of Saint-Lazare for Picasso was that the pregnant women could deliver their babies at Saint-Lazare and keep their babies with them while they were nursing them, and also toddlers if they were nursing them. So there were children at Saint-Lazare along with these women. So this change of tone that you see where the female figure becomes more enclosed, more reflective, not engaging with the viewer, is something that defines this moment as the blue period emerges in Paris. And this painting of evocation is also significant because the evocation really very complex painting about the death of the suicide of his friend Casagemas that had occurred just months earlier in Paris. His friend was 20, and this painting includes so many of the themes that incorporate the imagery of blue period Paris. It has to do with mourning figures that we see here in the bottom register, has to do with these figure of the mother and infant and the children in the center register, and then the prostitutes who are surrounding the figure of Casagemas that who's ascending to not a Christian heaven, but some other kind of heaven. And so, Kenneth, you've just rolled to the next slide. I'll quickly move on. The depictions of motherhood that I'm just pulling out here from the emerging blue period are very different from this work on the far left from St. Louis called The Mother. That is a work that may have been begun before the Velar show opened, but likely was completed after that show opened, but still shows so much of Picasso's interest in the mother and the child, mother and her infant, as being social outcasts on the margins of society. You see them here on the edge of a village or a city. And very much in the spirit of Daumier that you're seeing here, but also this kind of adaptation of flattened patterning that he would have found in Vuillard. But these other images draw upon the Madonna and Child, these maternities that are very specific to quasi-religious imagery that Picasso was using to elevate these women. And then the Woman and Child by the Sea is like she is a Saint-Lazare figure, takes it one step further, that also speaks to what is in the Barcelona works. And one last slide, Kenneth, I think, or yes, this one here shows how Picasso was drawing upon his interest in Puvis, which had been, he was certainly aware of Puvis from 1899 when he returned to Paris after an 18, or returned to Barcelona after an 18-month absence, and he saw Puvis' work at the 1900 exhibition, Universal Exhibition, including the Fisherman's Family that you see here, that this kind of seascape, the Mediterranean seascape that Puvis includes, is something that would have absolutely struck a chord with Picasso, and he creates this very flattened, patterned, banded interpretation of the sea in The Woman and Child by the Sea, and then this boat that is in the Poor Fisherman by Puvis, a major work that Picasso certainly saw multiple times at the Musée de Luxembourg in both 1900 and 1901. Seems to be indicative of death or impending death. This work by Picasso borrows not only motifs from Puvis, but also from a Barcelona poster that was a poster advertising a cure for syphilis. But Picasso, when he gave this painting, The Woman and Child by the Sea, to a Barcelona doctor who treated him for venereal disease, he called the painting The Flower of Evil. And one last slide, Kenneth, for me, please. This is the other major Blue Period painting from Paris, 1901, that I want to emphasize. On the right here, this painting called Melancholy Woman, or Woman Wearing a Shawl. This is so unusual. This is the only painting that includes a geometric interior space that is defined. It's not outside. It's not some, the Mother and Child by a Fountain has symbolic overtones that could be a baptismal font, perhaps, in that quasi-religious mingling of motifs. But here, this figure of the woman who looks down, who is, her arms are crossed across her chest. She's very interiorized. She's not looking at us, not engaging with us. Extremely unusual for Picasso to go and create this geometric interior space. And, certainly the Puvis painting of The Poor Fisherman is absolutely an inspiration for Picasso's thinking about existential loneliness and isolation, and recognizing these kind of religious motifs that are married into Puvis' work that Picasso can take into his own ideas that have to do with merging the sacred and the profane. So here is a woman from Saint-Lazare who's clearly a sinner in the church's eyes, but Picasso is trying to transform her into this heroic, holy heroine who is more universal in her endurance and her bondage. But that bondage, that enclosed geometric space, I, don't have the absolute answer to this question, but I put it out there that it is possible that Picasso could have been inspired by his experience at the Pantheon, seeing this mural to the right of the big tripartite mural of Saint Genevieve feeding a starving Paris. This singular vertical mural of Saint Genevieve watching over a sleeping Paris. Saint Genevieve is turned away from the viewer. We don't see her face. There is a geometric space that is clearly defined. It's moonlight that illuminates that balcony, and it's moonlight that illuminates the shoulders and the face of the woman in Picasso's painting. And so it's just always been of interest to me that possibly Picasso is like merging these two important Puvis works that he would have had opportunity to see together at this really juncture of the blue period at the end of 1901. So, Kenneth, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sue. And as Sue just explained, really what this exhibition argues is that the experience of Saint-Lazare transformed Picasso's attitude toward women. And, as you saw in Sue's presentation, women became more pensive, they became more self-enclosed, they became more and more at a physical and psychological remove from the beholder. And we argue in our exhibition, and one aspect of our exhibition that we felt we really needed to highlight was we needed to periodicize, provide a periodization of the blue period. And when Picasso left Paris at the beginning of 1902, and he moved to Barcelona, he was confronted with a very different environment. He arrived in a city that was in economic crisis. There was a burgeoning population of homeless people who were moving from rural areas of Spain into the industrial powerhouse that is Barcelona. But also in the month of February, meaning literally 1 month after Picasso returned to Barcelona from Paris, he was in a city that was in a general strike from February 17th through the 24th, and 100,000 workers took to the streets and erected barricades and fought the Spanish army in order to address labor inequities and other forms of inequality. And this has all been written about quite compellingly by Tema Kaplan, the great historian who wrote on these social movements in Barcelona. And so what we wanted to do in the exhibition was assemble these Barcelona Blue Period paintings to show how Picasso is not just responding to, as you can see in the Asahi painting, increasing numbers of homeless people in Barcelona, but he's rendering these figures more and more remote from the viewer. And I just want to direct your attention especially to the sculptural modeling you see in the backs of these women from the painting from Hiroshima, Two Women at a Bar, or the shawl of the woman in the Art Gallery of Ontario's Crouching Woman, and also his engagement with sculpture at this time. If you think of those early Parisian nudes that he made for Velar, they were available for your visual pleasure. They were these flat, decorous, or decorative surfaces. They were almost these vacuous objects that were there for your visual and sexual possession. And what we notice in 1902, when Picasso was responding to the socio-political exigencies of poverty, of homelessness in Barcelona, he's not just transforming these women into secularized Madonnas, but he's lending them a certain sculptural mass and volume and monumentality, but also a certain interiority, a psychological interiority, a pensiveness that makes them unavailable for visual or sexual possession. And one aspect that we really highlight in the exhibition is how he transforms the women in the Hiroshima painting into these massive objects that really, in fact, I think, repel any desire of the beholder to visually possess these women. What we also wanted to highlight in our exhibition about Barcelona was that the Blue Period, while it has its origins in Paris, when it was in Barcelona, Picasso was responding to the local artistic community. And our technical studies, and very briefly, you will notice that Picasso originally painted our Crouching Beggar Woman with an exposed arm. Here you see her hand holding a disc. He painted over that. He rejected that gesture in order to create a figure who is fully enshrouded in her shawl. And what Sue and I argue in the exhibition is that our painting Crouching Beggar Woman is really on the fault lines of Barcelona modernism. When Picasso returned to Barcelona in 1902, Isidre Nonel was really considered the leading painter of the Catalan avant-garde. And you see that he has these very expressive realist depictions of poverty that were published in Pellet Ploma's January 1902 issue. We know Picasso saw these drawings. And you can see how Picasso initially engaged with the kind of anecdotal gestures, these narrativizing gestures of stereotyped impoverished figures in our painting Crouching Beggar Woman, but he rejected it. And what we were able also to do with our technical studies is tie this underlying arm to the gesture of the Penitent Magdalene by El Greco and a collection of Santiago Rusiñol, the great symbolist painter of the Barcelona avant-garde. And what we argue is that Picasso, when he was painting these blue period women, rejected the politicized realism of Isidore Nonel and instead opted for the symbolism of Rossignol and the religious pathos and subtlety of El Greco and Rossignol. And this is how we arrive at the blue period women in Barcelona in 1902, specifically the Crouching Beggar Woman. And before I allow Sue to speak about 1903, I really just wanted everyone to pay attention to the patchwork modeling on the shawl of the Crouching Beggar Woman and look at the modeling in the El Greco. And again, I think for Barcelona and to understand the 1902 Barcelona blue period, one must understand the Barcelona avant-garde. One must understand the fault line between the expressive realism of the second generation modernistas, such as Nonel, and the symbolism of the first generation modernistas, such as Rossignol, and how Picasso rejected the political realism, the politicized expressive realism of Nonel, and reinscribed and reasserted the prominence of Rossignol's symbolism. And Sue, if you're able to offer us a brief summary of 1903 and 4.
Yes, I'm just going to say that 1903 was when Picasso reintroduced the figure of the man. The male figure disappeared in 1901 and 1902 and did not return in compositions until 1903. And so this gaunt, emaciated figure of the fisherman in Puvis' monumental painting is really a figure that speaks to Picasso's interpretation of the male figure in 1903, which you see in this drawing from the Art Institute of Chicago on the left, this painting from Smith College called Figures by the Sea that relates to the major painting at the National Gallery of Art, The Tragedy That Can Never Leave That Building. So it's not in the exhibition. But also El Greco is another figure that is important during this 1903 period because of the El Greco revival that Picasso was aware of, and the figure of the penitent Saint Peter that Picasso knew is one that that face, that bearded face, that emotional face, you can see in these pictures that I have here, including the figure of the man in the tragedy. And I think I'm just going to leave it at that because I know Aimée has things that she wants to go and speak about with Puvis and his work and how it relates to Picasso, especially in this moment here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, it's no surprise that the alert and young, ever-curious Picasso, arriving in Paris in 1900 and 1901, age 19 and 20, would seek out the work of Puvis de Chavannes, Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, who had recently died in 1898 at the age of 74. He was then the most internationally famous French artist at the, and so it hasn't been sufficiently noted until now, I think, the impact that Puvis de Chavannes had on Picasso's early direction and then some, which I hope to get to eventually. Puvis had had a 50-year career from 1848 to 1898 and in his death. And he was particularly renowned for his monumental mural paintings for public buildings throughout France. And indeed, even for the Boston Public Library, who wanted the most famous artist at the time to paint the murals for their new library. And he achieved also attention by the late 1870s for his easel paintings that were of a quite different order, such as the Poor Fisherman, Le Pauvre Pêcheur of 1881, that actually dates from the date of Picasso's birth. Despite his fame in his own time, and by the way, I have all kinds of things at the top. I hope you don't see them. All kinds of things that say annotate chat, right? Audience doesn't see them, right?
Looks good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Looks good.
Okay, good.
Yeah, we don't see it.
Anyway, despite the fame in his own time that Puvis had, and when Picasso sought him out, Puvis, as he's known to familiars, so we're going to call him Puvis this evening, is no longer that well known today, except for artists, perhaps. And at the end of my remarks today, I hope that I can address specific reasons, and there are specific reasons why he's not known today. And I'm showing this picture with the Picasso, The Tragedy on the right, and I think it's quite clear many of the aspects of the Puvis that have already been mentioned that were picked up by Picasso. The Poor Fisherman, which, let's see. The Poor Fisherman was hugely important to Picasso's formulating and developing his blue period paintings, as we've said. And it was exhibited then, as was said, at the Musée de Luxembourg, which was actually the Museum of Contemporary Art in Paris. So obviously it excited interest by not only Picasso, but other young artists at the time. It's a radically simple and pared down composition, as you see, and it features three figures: the gaunt fisherman standing in a boat with his jagged arms hugged close to his body, the female figure on the shore who's gathering some sparse flowers, and the baby on a cloth. And that they are isolated from one another instead of removed from one another and don't interact lends an enigmatic quality to the whole. A clearly defined zigzagging inlet or river and spits of land provide the bleak setting. The colors are muted, neutralized, and murky with a matte finish. Unmodulated by shading, their opacity contributes to the flattened whole, as does the high horizon. All these pared down elements, evenly parceled out over the whole, create a clear and legible composition of equal valences and contribute to a sense of remove, of irreality even, and intrigue. And there's a peculiarity to the whole, a plaintiveness and pathos that is quite new to this scene and new to Picasso when he saw it. This fisherman is an adamantly non-heroic figure in opposition to the celebratory story so central to the history of French 19th century imagery, narrative imagery. These details that I'm showing you now show the half-kneeling thin female figure with a sharp, thin face and unruly hair. In nondescript clothing, she's splayed out to be two-dimensional, and she's snatching up, as I said, these small flowers. These are not the flowery fields of Impressionism. As a prelude to Cézanne, the baby is not comfortably leaning back, but also two-dimensional. Puvis' Poor Fisherman, as I said, dates from 1881, the same year as Renoir's Luncheon on the Boating Party, which is from the Phillips collection in Washington, and dates from the heyday of Impressionism, as well as Picasso's birth. But Renoir's brightly colored canvas is one of sociability, a crowded group of somewhat soused and flirtatious men and women in the aftermath of a plentiful meal of food and drink, with the viewer all but at the table, and the daub paint adding to the movement and vitality, as well as the strong colors. Well, it's just what Puvis' painting is not, which is a certain paucity and parsimoniousness and restraint. But how Puvis got to the Poor Fisherman and other paintings of that ilk is what I want to mention next. On the left is the Prodigal Son. On the right, a study for the shepherd. These are only two of a whole group of paintings of this kind, that Puvis now turned to. These were rather more personal paintings in the late 1870s. Now he had already received fame as a great mural painter, and I will get to the monumental mural paintings in a minute because they help explain how he got to this style that you now have before you. The murals that he had painted for grand public buildings throughout France So you have the Prodigal Son, which is a quite personal painting. It's one of his series. One of his very earliest paintings had to do with Prodigal Son, and he may have, in fact, thought of himself as something of a prodigal son because his parents wanted him to be an engineer, and he became an artist instead, which they didn't live to see his greatness, however. The Prodigal Son, in a way, is a prelude to the Poor Fisherman, because it also explores a sort of isolated, meditative, and angular figure, figures that have a certain powerlessness and that are manifest, of course, through their gestures and their arms clasped close too, rather than occupying great spaces with great gestures as heroic figures do. Also note that the Prodigal Son is shifted to the side, and he doesn't occupy even the center and imposing center of the composition. And also he is not watching and monitoring the pigs, but looking away in a sort of a meditative way. The colors are dull, as you see, and also the landscape is strikingly forlorn and stifled. And to do this, to have the landscape respond to the mood of the painting is also very important, just as Picasso and others have their settings respond to the mood and colors and so forth that they're trying to convey. Now, I have to go to Puvis' first ambitions as a young artist, which were very ambitious indeed, because he wanted to do grand mural paintings, such as Delacroix and Chassereau had done before him to gain fame. And I'm only going to show you a few of his mural paintings because they speak to how he developed the flatness of his work, how he developed the tripartite, as you see even here, compositions of the landscape where you have the near shore, then you have the sea or the ocean, then you have the sky above. And these are sort of horizontal bands, as you say, see. And as they're up tilting, as he up tilts the whole landscape in order to flatten his paintings, that he was going to carry also to his easel paintings, such as the Poor Fisherman, and that the Picasso would take over too, in paintings like the Tragedy, which I showed you at the outset. And you also notice that these are horizontal bands, this tripartite, and the whole idea of flattening, which Puvis had himself picked up from early Renaissance Quattrocento paintings of the great artists like Piero. He also, as you see, uses these muted, opaque, matte colors so that everything is quite legible. Now, as cities burgeoned, as cities prospered in the 19th century throughout France, they started new museums. And then as now, if you had a new city and you wanted to attract attention, you established that fact of having arrived by creating a museum. And a host of French cities created such museums. Amiens, Lyon, Marseille, Lyon, Rouen, among them, all, and Puvis painted murals for all of these cities. In fact, great mural cycles. While his earliest programs for the new museum was for the new museum at Amiens, his development of a special aesthetic, such as I'm showing you now, may first be grasped in these paintings of 1869 for Marseille. The first one I show you here is Marseille Colonie Grecque. Marseille is a Greek colony, and it's also very savvy in terms of in terms of pleasing his patrons, which was not only the museum but the patrons who were the commercial body and burghers of Marseille. First of all, he's using, as you see, a classicizing style, and one which carried great cachet all through the 19th century. And he was very conscious of using it as having a great standing among people. But he's also showing that Marseille is a commercial and prosperous port. And even in ancient times, where in the foreground, women are examining fabrics, and there's a great bustlingness in the middle ground, especially to the left, with great buildings going on as well. And you see the Bay of Marseille in ancient times. I've already discussed then the tripartite divisions. Across from this Marseille as an ancient city is this, and you can see here the setting in the museum and how large, perhaps. I have the dimensions of all these paintings listed below for you to look at. Is Marseille as a modern port. And again, Puvis was very savvy in terms of what would appeal to the people who were sponsoring his paintings and touting different cities. So here, Marseille Porte de l'Orient, is Marseille is the gateway to the east, celebrates Marseille then in the background as then the fastest growing city in France, but also the greatest port in Europe. And you do see all sorts of immigrants in the boat, identifiable by their various clothes, coming in to Marseille. And this painting's of 1869, in fact, the date of the opening of the Suez Canal. And Napoleon III, then, who was the head of government, wanted to tout the increased communication and immigration between the Near East and then some with the opening of the Suez Canal and the joining of East and West. I'm hopping forward then to show more about how Puvis gauged his paintings to their environments. This is for his hometown, Lyon, in 1884-85. Only 2 of the 4 paintings, great mural wall paintings that are there. And on the left, you see his vision of antiquity. And on the right, as it folds around the corner of the painting, of the walls, sorry, you see his sacred wood dear to the arts and muses. It's important to note then how on the left you can see particularly that the colors of the mural, I hope you can tell, are gauged to the surrounding stone and porphyry decorations, and that the figures are all spread out. And I point this out because Puvis is moving away from choosing colors to be realistic or naturalistic, but having them gauged for some other reasons, which is what he would do throughout, to choose colors to transmit certain moods and meanings. On the right, you have the muses, and I'm not here to discuss the subjects, but rather how Puvis developed a style which was then going to be transmitted so strongly to Picasso. But of course, for museum, the very word museum comes from the word muséon, which is the place where the muses dwell. That is to say, each figure personifies or stands for various arts or, lyric poetry, et cetera, et cetera. The components then are very important. And you see in both paintings, the figures do not overlap, but are spaced out. And it's not, Puvis is not really about charm or naturalism or realism or even drama that might have governed other artists' choices at the time. Another important mural, which I hope makes my point, is Puvis' huge mural, which is some 18 feet high by nearly 94 feet long, for the main lecture hall of the great new Sorbonne in Paris, the University of Paris. And here you see it depicts personifications and figures representing the various academic departments, from history on the left to on the far right, natural history and the natural sciences and mathematics. And actually, there were quite some battles among the faculty about which departments wanted to be pictured next to other departments, but that's not part of this talk. But you do see, perhaps, I hope, that the layout, the horizontal layout of the whole, shows a regular rhythmic responses to the elements of the decoration of the architecture itself. So once again, Puvis is getting messages about how to work by looking outside to Beaux-Arts architecture and colors and so forth. And now going to specific murals and different series of his murals that were to impact Picasso very, very strongly. I'm showing you here a cartoon that is a preparatory work on it's quite large for work that he did for the Paris Hotel de Ville, the city hall. And Picasso was surely aware of either going to the city hall or one of the versions or more of the versions of these kinds of imagery, which were to impact his own pictures from the blue period of suffering, poor, scrawny, skinny figures, very much so. And also the idea of charity, which has been mentioned, which I'll come back to in a moment. And also notice that it is in Gifu, Japan, and I hope to get to the scattering and disbursement of Puvis' work, which also helped to explain why he's not better known today. As you see, it's a very bleak theme, and many things have been eliminated to show the sort of snowy scene, just a few figures, and not going back in space, because Puvis wrote about not making holes in walls with perspective, but the holes in walls and murals would have destroyed the architectural idea. In a way, this is less is more aesthetic avant la lettre before it got to that. And so note also the reduced colors. So he's just choosing a few colors here. It's a gray blue, and I'll show you more blues that Puvis came to in a moment. And it's important also that charity here for the Paris City Hall is pictured as a secular virtue. For at the time, the politics behind the time was the church and state were actually battling each other for power. And one of the things that the state asserted was that charity was not just a religious virtue, but it was a Parisian virtue. And the subject matter, you'll see in a moment how it plays out in the Paris City Hall. So this is here a schema that it's by Puvis de Chavannes. It's a small sketch in the upper right I show you, which is now in the Musée du Petit Palais in Paris, which shows the overall ceiling, which is the mural, well, it's a ceiling painting for the Paris City Hall, one of two great campaigns of painting murals that Puvis did representing the French state, representing the city. And you see that there are little blue different shapes there below. And one whole series of those represents, as I said, the so-called Parisian virtues, not secular. These are secular virtues. So in the schema on the bottom, here are some of them. It's patriotism is one of them. Then you see generosity and the half circle there with the gold background. And we're focusing particularly here on charity on the right, which will have, you'll see, has different, and I think Kenneth will speak eventually to different manifestations of that also in Picasso's work. Going back to the Pantheon, which has been mentioned, a little bit of background there too. The Pantheon was originally began as a church when it was built. It was the church dedicated to the patron saint of Paris, Saint Genevieve. Saint Genevieve, Puvis had in the 1870s already painted a group of paintings for for what was to become the Pantheon when it was secularized. It went back and forth between being a religious church and secularized from the French Revolution and all through the 19th century. Now, Genevieve, he had painted Genevieve as a young woman in the first campaign. Geneviève was rather like Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who then saved Paris from all kinds of trauma. The importance of the second campaign of Puvis, which shows the arrival of Geneviève on a boat to rescue the people of Paris. And this is a 5th century story that Attila the Hun surrounded Paris and cut off the people and was starving them to death. And that Genevieve came with all kinds of food and so forth to rescue the poor people of Paris. And that's the subject of this great mural. The mural is in 3 parts, but it was meant to look as if it's one great painting and going behind the engaged columns of the Pantheon. I'm showing you here an oil sketch by Puvis de Chavannes, which I think the whole thing is clearer what's happening here with Genevieve in white in the center coming on the boat and dockmen unloading the provisions for the people, and then people fainting from hunger while they're waiting for all this. Now, this is important to the Parisians because this is in the 1890s, but in 1870-71, the Franco-Prussian War meant that the Germans surrounded Paris and the people were starving also. And at the time, people even ate the zoo animals and rats. And so 20 years later, this idea of people being saved, the Parisians being saved from starvation was very important. And of course, it resonates right now with the Ukraine thing, with people's being surrounded and hoping for food and hoping for being rescued as well. I'm going to show you now here. This is the detail of the central panel. And I think though Picasso painted and drew, as you'll see in a moment, details from other parts of it, he must have seen these as well. First, you see Genevieve and greeting her is a sort of pictorial gambit that Puvis often did that was picked up by Picasso. And that was to see, if you see the woman greeting her with her arms extended and her elbows bent, she has her arms are parallel to one another. And Puvis often engineered his figures to have these parallel limbs, which I've called the sort of rhyming limbs, which engineer the figures into place, and which Picasso was very much to notice. Also, you see the young boy in the foreground who's very scrawny and all kind of elbows and knees bent and very zigzaggy, which certainly resonated with Picasso as well, although I know no drawings done after him. I'm showing you 2 other versions. On the right is the mural, but on the left, from a private collection in the collateral, well, it's now, well, was in the family's collection, is a study for that very section. And you see it squared for transfer, for enlargement and transfer. And what I particularly want to note here is that in the painting itself, the mural itself on the right, the colors have been adjusted to these gray blues, not only the figures, but also if you see the landscape in the distance, the blues, they're the ribbon of blue, again, using color to transmit a mood. I'm going to go 1 or 2 more here, and then Kenneth and Sue, it's over to you before I make my final remark. This is on the left, let's see, on the left and in the middle are 2 versions that Puvis did about the time that he did The Prodigal Son, just before The Poor Fisherman, of young women by the seaside, a larger one on the left and a middle one, a smaller one in the middle. And I'm comparing them to Picasso's 1903 Tragedy, one of the famous blue period Picassos. As you see, I think it's very clear you only have 3 figures there, and that we've already compared the man to the fellow and the poor fisherman himself. I want to not only emphasize the tripartite, again, landscape of near shore, water, and then sky, but also that Puvis makes it obstructs on the larger painting any kind of going back deep into space by pushing that big hillock that there. The 3 figures are disengaged from one another, each looking her own way. And of course, based on the ancient Venus emerging from the water, wringing out her hair. And curiously, figures going off, as you see the right-hand figure leaning back, so all angular again, which had an impact on a number of artists. And my last remark for right now is is that we will be looking on to later Picasso and Puvis' influence as a coda from at least my talk later when I wind up. But I did want to show this 1918 small Picasso of 3 figures, his own bathers, and they recall the isolated figures and independent figures of Puvis' canvas, wringing water from their hair. Especially notice the figure lying down in the center, which is basically the reverse of Puvis' figure on the left. And also notice, because I think Kenneth will come to it, she's sort of lying there in a zigzaggy fashion, very much as a figure in the Pantheon at the far left will be included, in which Picasso, as you'll see, Kenneth, I think will say, did drawings of that very figure. So remember the figure, the zigzaggy figure on the left, who's sort of all flattened out in that way. So thank you very much. Kenneth, your turn, or someone else's turn.
Thank you, Aimée. Would you be able to, yes, thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Aimée. And yes, Aimée, one aspect of our exhibition, one reason why we wanted to engage Aimée in this conversation about Puvis and Picasso is the impact that Puvis had on the Art Gallery of Ontario's The Soup. And I know, Sue, you have some remarks on this lovely picture on the left side of the screen, and then we'll begin to investigate the Art Gallery of Ontario's painting.
I just want to comment that the painting on the far left by Picasso is a work from early 1895, when Picasso was 13 years old. It's called Man with a Cap. Once upon a time, it was called Beggar with a Cap. And it is a beggar on the street from A Coruña, the seaport up in the northeast part of Spain that Picasso was living in for a number of years with his family. And it really just speaks to this ongoing interest that Picasso has in the homeless and the impoverished and the people who are begging on the street. And this particular example elevates that street figure into a format that's like the 17th century painter Jose de Ribera's images of saints that rely on everyday people as the model for those pictures. They're called the ragged philosophers. And so Picasso's really has a long-standing interest in the concept and the issues about charity and community. And so I turn it over to you, Kenneth, to pursue this further.
Great, thank you. The soup, we argue in this exhibition, is a representation of charity. And in order to show our visitors in the exhibition context that Picasso had a long-standing interest in the thematics of charity, we include this drawing in the upper right corner from 1897 and 99. And here you see a man giving alms to a family on the right side of the composition, the child with the arm outstretched, the mother huddled in the foreground. In the center is an important painting by Picasso. This is what one could call his presentation painting for admission into the Royal Academy of San Fernando in Madrid that he made in 1897, Science and Charity. It's an allegorical painting, the doctor representing science, the nun representing charity. And you notice the nun is serving this bedridden woman a bowl of soup. And when we were investigating our painting, came to our attention that this is a picture of charity. This is a picture of a woman, our Picasso in the lower right corner, offering a bowl of steaming nourishment to a very eager child. Now, when we were engaging in our investigations of this picture, we did follow a few prompts of scholars who have already tied the Art Gallery of Ontario's painting, The Soup, to this mural in the Pantheon that Aimée discussed. The translated title of the mural, which Puvis de Chavannes realized circa 1897-98, is, and I do think this is important, ardent in her faith and charity, Saint Geneviève, whom the greatest perils could not turn from her task, provisions Paris's besieged and menaced by hunger. Now, we know from sketches that Picasso made in 1902, and I think it's important to understand why Picasso would have revisited this theme of charity in the end of 1902. He was in Barcelona until October 1902. He returned to Paris in an attempt to sell some of his paintings, and it was a disastrous visit. He was basically couch surfing, moving from apartment to apartment, living in poverty and squalor. And because he had no canvases, he had no oils, he was sketching. And he would visit Paris's museums and Paris's civic structures, and he would sketch. And what I want to direct everyone's attention to is here we have Saint Geneviève engaging in an act of charity during the invasion of the Huns, as Aimée described. But here, look at this sketch here. And you see how Picasso has essentially sketched this figural group of an expired woman who's being revived by a bearded man and a woman in the lower left corner of Puvis, or lower right corner of Puvis' mural. And here he sketches this figural group and he writes, de Puvis in a Pantheon, from Puvis in the Pantheon. This figural group, we know, is something that preoccupied Picasso in late 02 and through 03. In the center here, this drawing that is in the Phillips collection presentation of our exhibition, here you see the woman literally pulling this expired woman off the ground by her arm. But importantly for the soup, I want everyone to see how the adaptation of this figural group, notice that here she's prostrate, there she's supine, this woman in the Z formation. Here she's being revived by this woman, but notice now that Picasso has more dramatically arched her back. But here we have a figure offering a bowl of soup to the expired woman that this other figure is attempting to revive. Here we're able to tie the thematics of the soup to Puvis' representation of charity. Also, I want to direct everyone's attention to this drawing figure imploring, this boy with his arms outstretched. And you can see how Picasso is essentially adapting to classicizing figures in this drawing that we're also able to date during this period of late 1902, when we know Picasso visited the Pantheon and sketched this mural by Puvis de Chavannes. What our exhibition contributes to the literature on Picasso and Pierre Puvis de Chavannes is that it was not just the Pantheon that impacted Picasso in late 02, early 03, but also the Hôtel de Ville, Paris's City Hall. Aimée has already described the mural of charity that Puvis realized in the Hôtel de Ville around 1893-94. What was a realization for me when planning this exhibition was this drawing from a private collection. A man who owns this drawing reached out to me and explained that he thinks he has a drawing related to the AGO's painting, The Soup. As you can see, he's right. In this vignette in the upper left corner, you see a man offering nourishment to a woman who's kneeling with her arm outstretched. Here you have a more fully realized version of this woman in the foreground. She's kneeling, her arm outstretched, but notice that she has a child feeding on her breast. What Sue and I argue in the exhibition is that this is this figure from Puvis' mural, rotated 180 degrees, and Picasso has shifted the figure somewhat insofar as she's not just clutching her child, but her child is breastfeeding. Now, what was important in our attempt to tie Puvis' mural of charity to Picasso's representation of charity is not just that Picasso is citing a figure in a preliminary sketch, but that in these more fully realized drawings of the soup, that Picasso is actually utilizing the formal devices of Puvis, the way Puvis spaces his figures in this mural. Keep in mind, think of the young Picasso in 1902 coming in with his sketchbook, and he's looking up, craning his neck, looking at this mural that is probably 20 feet, 30 feet above him. And he's using, Puvis knew that his audience would be far below, and Puvis spaced his figures, gave them ample room so that their gestures would be legible and visible from afar. And here is Picasso utilizing that logic in order to give each of the figures, although he's sketching them on small sheets of paper, the same space. He's utilizing this spatial the spacing that Puvis uses in his figures and his murals in his drawings. But what was a real realization for Sue, Aimée, and I, we were on the telephone one day discussing the charity mural and the soup and these preliminary sketches. This is from late '02. Look at the parallel lines formed by the arm of the boy and the arm of the girl, and look at how that parallelogram, it mimics the parallelogram formed by this caped and gowned woman who is engaging in an act of charity toward these shivering figures. And we were able to see how Picasso is even looking at the negative spaces in Puvis' murals as he's structuring his figural groups in the preliminary sketches for the Art Gallery of Ontario's The Soup. Puvis, I believe, was very foundational to Picasso's spare composition in The Soup. You see that Picasso in these preliminary sketches, he eliminates this left arm of the young girl that interrupts this empty parallelogram. And you can see he's moving toward a formal simplicity of Puvis. This final sketch here is an important drawing that was in the Art Gallery of Ontario's presentation of the exhibition. What I want to direct everyone's attention to is how Picasso was looking hard at Puvis in late '02. And especially look at how this drawing for The Soup, how he relates it on the same sheet to a drawing related to the picture from the Pola Museum with the boat from the Poor Fisherman floating in the background. And you can see that Puvis was fundamental to Picasso when he was formulating these early drawings in relation to The Soup. But more importantly, what Picasso was able to do when working toward The Soup in late '02, early '03, he saw in Puvis a secularized or mythical allegorical depiction of charity that dovetailed with his longstanding interests. But Picasso, himself starving in late '02, early '03, saw in Puvis an ennobled, almost timeless, allegorical representation of acts of charity that he doesn't limit Picasso to virtuous civic acts of timeless figures, but instead he transfers to the daily struggles of the poor. And I think that what I find fascinating about the Art Gallery of Ontario's The Soup, and here is the painting again, lest we forget, here, is that he takes the mythic, timeless, allegorical quality of Puvis, and he uses that logic in order to ennoble the daily struggles of the poor. And if you think of what Picasso is essentially doing by taking the civic virtue depicted by Puvis and transferring it to the poor, Picasso almost is arguing that virtuous behavior is not meant to be found in timeless allegorical scenes that have nothing to do with daily life, but in fact, virtue is to be found in the everyday struggles of the poor. And I think this is what's so powerful about The Soup. And finally, what I want to argue about the impact of Puvis on Picasso, this is a preliminary sketch that Picasso made in Barcelona in 1902 of a man with his arms outstretched, offering a circular object to a figure who has not yet been rendered. And you see in the vignette, you have a more realized version. Below, you see that Picasso in this rendition of The Soup, it was initially a standing male figure offering a young girl an object, as you can see rendered here. Picasso, after studying Puvis' murals in Paris, substituted women for men. And I think the reason why he did this in these drawings is simply because for Puvis, the main protagonist, the main allegorical protagonists in his murals are women. And Picasso abandoned the use of the men as the agents of charity in his drawings and substituted them for women following Puvis' example. And lastly, what I want to mention is I want everyone to see that in this preliminary sketch that Picasso made in Barcelona in 1902, the soup was initially a vertical format. This on a vertical format picture. What you remember, the soup is a small horizontally formatted painting. And what Sue and I argue in our exhibition is that Picasso jettisoned the vertical format and substituted it for the horizontal format that we see in the soup, which is anomalous in 1903 for his grand monumental pictures, because he was inspired by the horizontal format of the irregularly shaped trapezoidal vault of Puvis' charity mural. And because he was explicitly citing Puvis' allegorical depiction of charity in the Hotel de Ville, he abandoned the vertical format and opted for a horizontal canvas instead. And I think now, Sue, you will discuss Puvis' impact on Picasso in '04 and beyond.
I just want to briefly, because I know we've gone overtime here, but I just want to briefly bring forward that after Picasso moved permanently to Paris in April 1904, the Blue Period does continue throughout the remainder of 1904, but after Puvis' retrospective in the Salon d'Automne of 1904, and Picasso was interacting with French poets and other artists that opened up new opportunities for him, that expanded his social circle. But the work of Puvis that he saw in 1904 made its way into his work very rapidly in 1905. And I just bring forward as an example, the watercolor called Circus Family that is at the Baltimore Museum of Art from 1905 that you see in the bottom center, and the accompanying dry point from a series of prints from a series called the Saltimbanques that you see on the upper left that translated this watercolor into a print. That Picasso is like exploring a more Arcadian vision, that he was now having had an opportunity to see a larger breadth of Puvis' work in this retrospective in 1904 that had 43 works in it. Picasso was like open to adapting motifs and ideas, compositional strategies from Puvis in a manner that we don't see as often in the Blue Period work. And so this particular work, you know, I've just brought forward Puvis' 1873 work of Summer, this Arcadian vision of women in the fields that, you know, seems to have been an important source for Picasso in this. You see Picasso using this frieze-like, you know, arrangement of figures, the flattening of space, the kind of soft pastel, dusty colors that you see here. Very different than the Blue Period imagery. And I just draw attention down here to the bottom left of the watercolor. It's, you know, Picasso has taken this motif of the baby from the Poor Fisherman, and he's like duplicated it into a positive and a negative form in the Circus Family. And
but I would also like to point out a little beyond blue. May I do that now?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see, share screen. Oh, maybe I can't do it while you're doing it. Okay.
So Kenneth, do you have to give Aimée opportunity to take her screen? Share her screen.
Okay, just to whip. Just a moment here. I just wanted to also do that Puvis' last painting was the Magdalene, which is now in Budapest in 1897. And I just wanted to go beyond blue also in my rendering of Puvis and Picasso, because after the First World War, Picasso went back to a kind of classicizing, as you remember, it's called le rappel à l'ordre, a sense to order things again and not have the kind of fragmentary things he did in Cubism. And I show two paintings by Picasso that I think are very much influenced by Puvis, paintings such as this one. And I think they speak for themselves in terms of these monumentalized women. It's interesting that the Puvis is the Magdalene, because for all intents and purposes, she looks like a bather. And then, of course, even the gestures and harrowing down. Notice also in the Puvis, the Magdalene, there is the divided faces you see here, which Picasso, Puvis did this earlier too, but I think that Picasso picked up on that, a face that's both a profile and a full face at once. So that's what I wanted to say. May I also say, either now or later, why I think Puvis is not, I would say there are three reasons that Puvis is not recognized today. One of them is that his own fame in his own time made that everybody wanted to buy Puvis de Chavannes paintings, and there was an avid vogue for his paintings. And although the family donated hundreds of paintings literally to museums in France and thousands of drawings, the family of the lesser nobility of Puvis de Chavannes kept many of them in great folios, and literally, again, thousands of drawings and many paintings in their chateaus all the way throughout France. And so one reason he's not well known was all these things had scattered and were no longer exhibited as a whole, and the corpus of his work was lost. And I think the second reason is very much, so ironically, he was a victim of his very own successes. But another reason was that the great mural cycles had scattered also, as I said, all over France. And in order to really understand his work, people have to go visit these mural cycles all over, and people just don't, because it's just too much unless they're really studying Puvis himself. And finally, I think a most important reason that Puvis has fallen by the wayside is the way that most 19th century painting has been taught or introduced in most schools and most museums is one of the great movements in 19th century art, from classicism and neoclassicism to romanticism to naturalism and realism to impressionism and neo-impressionism, post-impressionism. And Puvis really doesn't fit into any of those categories, and therefore he's simply been fallen by the wayside and isn't discussed at all in introductory or most courses and teachings. So there's a problem with art history there and categorizations. And finally, I wanted to show, just an ending, that a very blue early Puvis, the Fantasy, which is now in Karashiki, Japan, and to show how worldwide he has gone and scattered. Postage stamps from Somalia, it issued in 2003 with images of Puvis de Chavannes' works, both the Fantasy there you see on the left and then the stamp on the right, and other paintings that we have discussed and perhaps that Susan, you're going to discuss further. So thank you very much. Back to you.
Kenneth, why don't you close with your discussion about the Albright Knox painting of the Toilette, which we have in your venue of the exhibition, because it really kind of encapsulates so many of these ideas of the Puvis kind of being important to this next moment in Picasso's career. You're unmute, yeah.
Happily, I will. And at the Art Gallery of Ontario presentation, we were lucky to have the painting from the Albright Knox Art Gallery, La Toilette, which, believe it or not, is the first Picasso to enter an art museum in North America. And what I have done here is I just want to show how fundamental the impact of Puvis was on the young Picasso. And first, let's look at the pose of this maidservant. So La Toilette is a double portrait of Fernand Olivier. Fernand Olivier as Venus and Fernand Olivier as maidservant who is holding the mirror before Venus, who is at her toilette, and here she is arranging her hair. Now, I want first everyone to see just a hieratic manner in which Fernand Olivier's maidservant is presenting the mirror to Fernand as Venus at her toilette. And just observe the hieratic nature in which Saint-Geneviève extends her arm before the starving populace of Paris, but also the profile pose. But then look here at how this foot of the maidservant is just flat on the ground. And look at how this foot of the stevedore is flat on the ground. And then notice the foot turned and the bent leg, the contrapposto, and how Picasso, these classicizing poses that he especially uses in the Gozal period, you can see he's really readapting the poses of Puvis de Chavannes, as he especially saw in the Pantheon murals. I just think that these figures were almost combined when he was conceiving of the maidservant in the Albright Knox painting. But then I look at the maidservant and the graceful, or the nude of her toilette in a graceful manner in which she encircles her head with her arms. And here you see l'été. And this is really what Sue and I want to argue about Picasso and Puvis, is that it was just not the Pantheon murals, but that the Hôtel de Ville is also fundamental to understanding Picasso's reception of Puvis. So here, L'été, realized in 1891 by Puvis, and Sue kindly provided the sepia photograph. This was in the Salon de Zodiac in the Hôtel de Ville. And I want to direct everyone's attention to this bather who also gracefully encircles her head under her cape, as she's seated near the river Seine, and just compare her to the figure in the Albright Knox. Even compare, I know that this is a horrible reproduction and I apologize, but even her breasts, it almost seems as if just the upper half of this figure, Picasso was adapted in this representation of La Toilette in the Albright Knox. But if anything, I think these stiff, staid, classicizing poses, these mannered, graceful poses of these nudes and these figures that you see in the Gozal period of 1906, one can see that it's not just Ingres, which we know, but I think Puvis did have this impact on Picasso. And it's not just the Pantheon murals, but I think the role that Hôtel de Ville murals played in Picasso's formation in his early years, in that fundamental decade of the aughts, especially during the Blue and Rose period, there's still a lot of work to be done. And perhaps maybe Aimée, this can be another project for you. But I really, thought that it would be important to show this juxtaposition of L'été from the Hôtel de Ville and the Albright Knox painting, to show that it wasn't just Le Soup that was impacted by the murals in the Hôtel de Ville, but even later pictures from the Rose period. And I do want to thank everyone who is still here for your patience with us as we try to survey this topic. But now I think would be the time for us to entertain some questions.
Well, I will applaud you for the group. I want to thank you all. That was epic and amazing. And it's impossible to look. I mean, it was amazing. It's impossible to look at the soup and not see it differently after the presentation with Puvis. And it also makes me wonder about the other French artists at the time, like a Matisse or somebody, and their paintings, that what he's taking from Puvis. But that's another lecture probably.
No, it is another lecture, but by the way, Puvis helped the young Matisse get into an exhibition. So that's.
There have been a lot of comments and questions coming in. So if you can put your questions in the actual Q&A icon, it's a little easier for me. But here's a question from Joseph Kiefer. They're asking, did Picasso ever talk about Puvis' influence to his friends and dealers that we know of? To anyone?
That is an interesting question. And I confess that I personally have not delved into this in that kind of thinking about that question, but there was, with this band of Picasso that was at the Bateau Lavoir starting in 1905, particularly Max Jacob and André Salmon and Gustave and Apollinaire. Fernand Olivier does kind of write about this in terms of, they would kind of be playful about imitating the kind of grand artists of the past and the present. And so there was, an interest in like, let's do Puvis. And so he was definitely part of that kind of larger awareness of like important French artists. But, I'm not able to go and speak to specifically whether he spoke about Puvis to dealers or other artists. Kenneth, do you know?
Oh, I mean, what we do know, so in the 1920s, the poet Max Jacob did publish both in Vanity Fair, first in English, and then a few years later in the Cahiers d'Art, his recollections of Picasso. You can imagine, I mean, Picasso was only mid-career at this point, and people are already recollecting him. And Max Jacob mentioned how during that disastrous third visit to Paris in the winter of 1902, an exceptionally cold winter, he visited Picasso at the Hôtel du Maroc. And Picasso was staying with a group of Catalan artists. And what Max Jacob remembers is how in the apartment of a man named Aguero, a sculptor from Catalonia, how they shared a bed, Picasso and Aguero, and strewn across that bed and across the floor of the apartment were sketches in the manner of Puvis. And Max Jacob went on to explain how a student he was mentoring at that time was almost appalled at the poverty that he saw in Aguero's apartment. But what we do have documentation from Jacob, who became Picasso's roommate later when Picasso moved into his apartment after he left the band of Catalans in the Hôtel du Maroc. But that, the mythology was that during that winter, it was exceptionally cold, and Picasso almost, this is a literary trope in late 19th century French operas, but that he was burning his drawings to stay warm. But we do know that, Max Jacob in his recollections, which I'm sure and certain he probably discussed with Picasso, mentions the impact of Puvis during that disastrous winter of 02-03. And of course, we do have the evidence in the drawing from the Museo Picasso Barcelona, where Picasso in his hand writes De Puvis na Pantheon, where he explicitly acknowledges his source in these 1902 drawings of the Pantheon and Puvis.
But it's also true that an artist may or may not acknowledge, of course, the influence of another artist on himself or herself, whereas Van Gogh did acknowledge and wrote about Puvis in many letters. Gauguin said once too often, "Oh, Puvis never influenced me. No, he never influenced me." He said it again and again, and yet one can parse the Gauguin absolutely right out of Puvis over and over. So, as you say, the evidence isn't necessarily in voiced and oral or written acknowledgement of influences.
It's a great answer. I think that just there were a couple of questions that came in that I think you both just answered really well. Suzanne Brunner is asking, was it customary to copy paintings from another artist? I assume that most of the important Impressionist painters painted from a model.
I mean, I would say is, Picasso is academically trained. I mean, he never, completed his studies at academies, but his father was also an academic. And even when you look at just the history of French painting, or even Spanish painting, I mean, students were trained to sketch after plasters, after paintings. And Picasso was part of that long tradition that, you can maybe even trace to, the French academies in the 1640s, where you did study major paintings by your predecessors. You sketched figures from those paintings. And then when you made your own picture, you adapted and shifted somewhat. And Picasso is part of that long tradition that one can trace back to Poussin. And in many respects, as avant-garde as we think Picasso is, his reliance on tradition, his citations of transition, but his transformations of transition of his precursors situates him, however paradoxically, in a long academic tradition that one can trace to the 17th century. And Mayor Sue, I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Yes, because as you say, it is a tradition to do copies. And in fact, a list was started, which has been very helpful to me, of copyists at the Louvre and who went to copy which paintings and who copied Puvis. The copyists had to the official ones had to register, and they were only allowed to do copies that were different dimensions from the actual one. Although there have been a lot of, when people ask me to authenticate works, etc., many of them either meant to be copies, but were since signed Puvis by other people and sold as authentic Puvis. So copying is a long tradition for learning, and then they may come out later and on the market as authentic things, and at least in the case of Puvis.
So I just wanted to add on this that Picasso is absolutely within that academic tradition, as Kenneth has explained, but he is also an artist who prided himself from very early on, not living within the strict confines of being a copyist, that he would study the work of both his contemporaries and the old masters, and he would take what he wanted from them and make it something that was uniquely his own voice, so that it's he did correct people when they say, oh, you did Toulouse-Lautrec, and he would say, no, nothing I did could be taken for a Toulouse-Lautrec painting, but I took what I wanted from Toulouse-Lautrec and did my own. And this is something that certainly when he's looking at Puvis, it is, the studies on the soup are so interesting because they are different than so many other moments during this blue period, where that particular painting has so many drawings that are related to it. That is not always the case in this blue period, or even in the period that follows, that Picasso would not do these intense kind of preliminary drawings to get to a concluding painting.
Sorry. But,
no, I'm finished.
Okay, because Sam, going back to how you learned to paint at the New York Studio School itself, as you could probably tell the viewers or listeners, the New York Studio School, which is sponsoring this, is a great school for very serious and ambitious young artists and not so young artists. And maybe you want to talk about renditions, Sam.
I don't want to. I want to stay away.
Okay, but basically,
it is. I think it is still very important, and I think a lot of artists have different ways of going about that, and it's certainly something we.
Students are encouraged to do renditions, which are their own takeoffs of important works,
There's
famous
definitely
works.
a lot you can learn by doing transcriptions of artists' work, is sort of what we call it.
And to learn from them.
Yeah, and to add to that point, just generally, I think it's interesting to see how Picasso, not just the colors, but to what Kenneth was speaking about with the negative space and the structure of Puvis, like that's something that Picasso seems to really run with, and where his work becomes extremely structural, and he starts, the amount of triangles in the Poor Fisherman, for example, that there's quite a lot of diamonds and triangles in that painting, you know, thinking about how Picasso may have drawn from that quite to an extreme, as not, you know, I don't think you can document that, but it's something powerful in Puvis' work. I mean, in both of their work. And there's sort of a logistical question of maybe Kenneth or Sue could speak to the exhibition catalog. Someone's wondering if there is one, and there is, I'm sure. Could be purchased through the Phillips collection?
Well, I think what we would encourage our listeners to do right now would be, if you want a catalog, if you're in New York, or even if you're in the United States, find a way to get to the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. There are copies of the catalog available in their bookstore. You can purchase it from a staff member at the Phillips collection, and you'll have a chance to see the exhibition. I think that would be the best way to obtain a catalog, but they are available on Amazon.com and through any other bookseller. But I think the best way to obtain a catalog for our exhibition would be to visit the Phillips collection and see Sue's wonderful installation.
It's a stupendous catalog.
I'm telling you, you know, we knocked ourselves crazy trying to put that catalog together. So, you know, and I want to congratulate you, Aimée, because, you know, your research has been foundational to our understanding of Puvis. You know, there's absolutely, you have opened our eyes and given us an opportunity to kind of look at him as an artist that is foundational to Picasso from the beginning.
Thank you.
I mean, and also, I mean, and May, you might have a comment about this, but working at the Art Gallery of Ontario, you know, we have to reckon with our past here. And I know that Richard Wattenmaker had his exhibition in 1966 at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Puvis in the Modern Tradition. And Puvis in the Modern Tradition involved a discussion of Puvis' impact on Picasso. And so I think it's fitting in many respects. And were you involved?
I gave a talk at that exhibit in 1975 or 6 then.
So here we come full circle, where we not just honor the scholarship of Richard Wattenmaker, my predecessor, but here we're bringing you again to speak about an exhibition in which the Art Gallery of Ontario was involved as co-organizer with Phillips Collection, and we're revisiting this topic and we're expanding our knowledge. And I think that it's fitting that you're participating in this project. But as Sue said, you were really foundational, Aimée, to our ability to understand Picasso's reception of Puvis. But I think it was that conversation where we were able to tie some of those preliminary sketches for the soup to the compositional structure of La Charité in the Hôtel de Ville. I think that for me was a revelation, and I want to thank you for that.
Well, that's very kind, and I just want you to know that I was working on Puvis for many years, so many years that at least one of my sons called him Uncle Puvis.
I want to thank you all, to our audience members, for joining us. I want to thank our panelists for this amazing exploration. Truly engrossing. I agree. And absolutely the best way to see a painting is to go stand in front of it. So please do go to the Phillips collection and then purchase that catalog, and maybe catch a flight to Paris for the expanded edition. But thank you all so much. And any last words from our panelists?
Au revoir.
Thank you for the opportunity to go and have this engaging conversation, and thank you to your audience for being so patient with us.
Yes, and thank you for the invitation, New York Studio School, and I want to thank our audience for listening. Again, I want to encourage everyone to see the exhibition in Washington, D.C. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
And thank you, Sue. Thank you, Kenneth. And thank you, Sam. And thank you, everybody, really.
Right. Well,